Welcome to Not Just a Transaction, the podcast series hosted by experienced real estate authorities Nick Prefontaine and Zachary Beach. Each week, the hosts bring you expert guests to help you navigate the many creative options available for buying or selling a home, while cutting out the costly hurdles of a conventional real estate deal.
Everybody, this is Zachary Beach and Nick Prefontaine. Welcome to another Not Just a Transaction podcast where we talk to local or national people here that have expertise in certain subjects, specifically ones that will help you, the buyer, you, the seller, make your best decision. This is the Buyer and Sellers podcast. And we're going to also talk about why it is not just a transaction to our guest here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest. Her name is Leigh Brown. You guys are in for an absolute treat. She has a highly successful realtor, best-selling author, and that is just scratching the surface here. So we'll dive into some other aspects of who Leigh Brown is as we start this conversation. But Nick, Leigh, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here today.
Happy to have you with us, Leigh. Share your insight and expertise. Definitely.
Well, I'm glad to meet the rest of the family since Chris was on my podcast, and I feel like I've met the patriarch, so now I'm meeting the minions, I guess. Is that how this works?
I've never heard it described that way, but I mean, I guess
he's going to love that. Just so you know, he's going to eat that shit up, Nick.
Oh, I know. There's nothing wrong with that. I've never heard it phrased that way.
They'll be 100% edited out of this podcast. Oh, I love it. So Leigh, I gave this a brief introduction of who you are, but you are in so many different facets of not only the real estate business, but I know you have some involvements in government and policy and all that as well. So if you could, let's start with who you are from your perspective, and that way the listeners can get a better idea of who's chatting today.
Absolutely. Well, I am Leigh Brown. I am a realtor for the last 21 years. I do primarily residential real estate. And here in the last year, I've moved a lot into multifamily and land development. Just as the market continues to move, I like to grow and learn with it, which is the feature and the bug of being the daughter of a realtor. My dad became a realtor in 1978. And his dad was a custom home builder. So this is all in my blood. And in the time frame that I have been a realtor, I've also opened, more than one brokerage. I sold my property management firm, which was the happiest day ever in my real estate life here in Concord, North Carolina, just outside of Charlotte. But full disclosure, I still hire a property manager because I can't stand the low margin, high headache end of the business. And God bless the ones who do. That is not my wheelhouse because I know me. And what me likes is really smart real estate decisions. And I love helping my neighbors figure that out because, as you have already referenced with this concept of being more than a transaction, my hashtag has been more than houses for a long time because we have to think beyond the sign in the yard and beyond the one purchase, the one sale for the neighbor who bought or sold that house, but also for all of us, because America is the last country with good property rights left on earth, and they're seriously under attack right now, which is why a lot of my volunteer efforts go toward the advocacy side, working in housing policy, which is not very sexy, so people don't pay attention to it until it's too late. So I am wearing a lot of different hats, but I do it because I love real estate. I love what it does for people and building generational wealth and stability and security and building entrepreneurs. And that's a long answer to your question. But if your listeners have figured anything out about me by now, it's that I don't answer anything with less than about 4 words.
Well, Leigh, I wouldn't know that you wore any hats because your hair is so nice.
Thank you, Nick. I will tell my hairdresser to listen to this episode because he takes great pride in my hair.
Brownie points, Nick. He's learned that skill, brownie points. I love it. So, I mean, you're obviously doing a lot, and then you said that you're really working on policy. Like, why is that important to you? Because I think that when you work on policy, that it affects everybody. So it's going to affect the sellers that are listening to this. It's going to affect the buyers. It's going to affect the realtors. It's going to affect the investors. So there's all of that. So tell us why that's important to you.
Well, full disclosure, I'm a political junkie. I have been my whole life. I love politics because I look at that as its own sport. And I grew up running track and playing softball, so sports is in my blood. And unfortunately, political sport is a blood sport right now. And whose blood gets left on the field is not the politicians. It is us, the people, the citizens, because there are decisions being made every day that are huge, giant, massive ramifications. But the expectation is that the public won't pay attention to it, because if I start talking about GSEs, the government sanctioned entities, that's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Well, most people just heard wah, 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 like I'm Charlie Brown's teacher, because it suddenly feels too big and too wonky to understand. But what you should know is that Fannie and Freddie are the underpinning of the 30-year mortgage. It's a government-backed note which allows banks to lend money on favorable terms to the consumer, and also to the bank, but to the consumer. Without the 30-year fixed, most of us, including me and the two of you, I'm going to just wager a wild guess, your first house was a 30-year fixed mortgage. It was probably something with a lower down payment because you were trying to get into the marketplace with that first primary residence. So if you lose that, you're never getting it back. I mean, look at Obamacare as an example, and I don't care where you are politically. We all can agree Obamacare has been an unmitigated disaster for healthcare because it has jacked up everybody's cost. It has made care harder to get, and still every politician says they want to fix it. They don't want to fix it. They like having problems because then they can pretend they have a solution. But what happens is we've now played defense for the last 12 years trying to find a better solution. I don't want to see that happen in the real estate side and in private property rights, because if we take away the 30-year fixed, you think we're ever getting it back? Hell no, because politicians have a vested interest in not making things right. I want to be the voice that says we need 30-year fixed mortgages. That's where affordability has its stronghold, and we have affordability issues right now. I want to protect people against onerous property taxes, which a lot of consumers are starting to question now with the public schools being shut down for so long, which are primarily funded by property taxes. What is going on with our dollars? They're our dollars. And when you think about this as a homeowner, you're paying taxes on your property, which you also have to upkeep because you got to take care of your investment. So I don't mind paying taxes if I feel my dollars are well spent. They're not always well spent. So if I don't speak up for that, who's going to, Zach? I mean, this is the question we have to ask ourselves. You can't assume that somebody else is going to do it, because I enjoy it, and I enjoy the reading and the research, and I enjoy figuring out the challenges, and I also love looking for solutions. That's one of my strengths, and it's frankly probably why I lost the 2 times I ran for office. I'm way too solution focused and less on creating fear mongering and hollering amongst people. That's who needs to be at the front of these decisions. And from an investor standpoint, because most of your listeners are thinking, what is she talking about here? The 1031, if you're an experienced real estate investor, you know that that is one of the most beautiful tax laws we have that allows an investor to say, I've got a duplex, but there's a quadplex I'd like to buy over here. I want to take the money that's accumulated in equity in the duplex so I can buy something larger that has more doors. One of the keys to successful real estate investing, as we know, is having more doors. If you go from 2 to 4 and you can move that 50 grand over here without paying taxes right now, you can get the 4 doors. This investor is not avoiding taxation. They are simply delaying it until sometime in the future when they will pay taxes when they're done rolling up their real estate gains. But in the meantime, that investor went from providing 2 places to live to providing 4 places to live. That makes our community stronger when we have more supply in the marketplace, whether it's on the tenant side or the homeowner side. Well, that's one of those tax laws that's under attack right now. You have a lot of regulators that want to get rid of the 1031 because they see it as a chance to grab the tax dollars between the duplex and the quadplex. But any savvy person would know that if you want to tax the dollars between the 2 properties, all you're going to do is put the market on freeze, because that investor is going to say, I'll just stay in my duplex. I'm not going to move it if I'm going to get taxed on it. So then you hurt the market because you hurt supply. And all of those things are big economic drivers. They're big decision makers that most of the public has no information about because it's not sexy enough for CNN and Fox News to bring talking heads on to fight about it. So regulators do, in essence, what they want. I'm not comfortable with regulators making decisions that affect my property without my input.
I love it.
Well, Leigh, I love what you said, especially at the beginning when you talked about how you were too solution orientated, focused on that, and to run for office, to be able to be elected for office because you were looking for solutions. We're looking for solutions for all of our buyers and sellers, and that's what we do every day, and that's part of the one of the reasons that we're doing this show, that we're doing this podcast, to help buyers and sellers out there. So we appreciate you sharing your insight.
I mean, Nick, can you imagine if we had real estate professionals, whether they're practicing realtors or they're experienced investors or they're people who do the private money lending, if that was who was making our decisions from elected positions, that would be an entirely different set of outcomes. Because the world that we live in, whether you're looking to get involved in investing with seller financing and no money down, or you're looking to hire a realtor to buy your primary residence, when you're working in our space, every single thing we do is looking for solutions. We look for the place where people can come to an agreement to move everybody forward in a way that is effective and does make sense. I do believe if more of us were in office, you would see a different outcome than a whole bunch of people who have this mindset of, if I just get in there one time, I'm set for life, which is why I'm also a fan of term limits, just to be honest with you. But
Absolutely.
The big
It's funny if
is never solve it, but we're always solve it people.
Yeah, exactly. If that happened, I can't even fathom what would happen, how efficient the world would be if like someone like us got into office. Yeah, that's amazing. So I think one of Zach and I's questions that we had next is, how do you really affect helping buyers and sellers? Where do you see yourself doing the most good in that respect?
From a policy standpoint or from a practitioner standpoint?
No, from a practitioner, like from a day-to-day.
Oh, my number one thing that I bring to my buyer and seller clients is absolute 100% truth telling. And what that means is that a lot of times I tell people, no, do not buy this. No, do not sell this. Yes, you need to sit tight. So I'll give you a very clear real world example. I'm working with a first time buyer right now, and I love her. She's almost 30 and she's buying her first property. She came to me and said, I want to buy a new townhouse. And so we set up our consultation. So for me, the consultation is all about creating the golden corral, right? So we're going to look at the big buffet. So I laid out my piece of paper and said, all right, here's the pros and cons on that new townhouse. How about a resale? What about new single family? What about resale single family? Ooh, what about a duplex? Did you know about a quadplex? I skipped the tris because we just don't have triplexes in the Charlotte market for the large part. And her eyes got wider and wider and wider as she looked at the idea that she could either pay above full price, which is what's happening in the resale market because of what I think is the worst practice ever, which are appraisal waivers. They bother the shit out of me because I don't think it's a fiduciary. I don't think you're living up to your fiduciary role if you're advising somebody to waive their appraisal and pay extra above market, because our market is really frothy right now, I think. But when you look at telling somebody you could actually buy a duplex, live in one side, have your privacy, but have a neighbor over here that's paying the rent, it's an entirely different way to look at things. I think that's my differentiation in the market, is to help people see all the options so that they can think bigger term. And then the next thing I told her after we looked at that menu is, sister, this house that you're buying, my intention is that you will never sell it. I want you to buy something that you can keep forever as the cornerstone of your real estate empire. So you're going to be able to rent this thing out in the future. And then you can buy the next property, and you can buy the next property, and you can really start scaling up. And I really wish more real estate professionals thought about the business in that way, because too many times people never hear about the ideas of real estate investment because it feels too big and it feels out of reach. It's not out of reach. It's all about figuring out how to create a process map for the future. So my young lady, every time we talk, she's like, okay, so can I rent this thing in 3 years? And I'm like, yes, sister, we can rent this one in 3 years, because I've got her thinking differently now. And that makes my heart so glad.
You already have her mindset thinking about that. That's great. The exit or the potential, the next property that she'll get.
And then I also,
that's awesome.
When she falls in love and gets married, I'm totally running a credit check on that man, because he's going to be walking into her empire and she's got to protect it.
Oh yeah, Absolutely.
I love it. I love
For
it.
sure.
So we covered, we covered who you are, what you do. So now what's most important to us is, because the podcast is not just a transaction. So why is it not just a transaction to you? Like, why do you give a shit, Leigh?
This is where I live. Now, how often do we forget that when we're dealing with real estate, whether we're buying or selling investment properties or doing anything related to this? This is the dirt we walk on. It's the dirt we live on. It's where our kids' friends live. It's where our kids want to buy and our grandkids want to have a place. There's so much future casting that goes into real estate. And I know that from where I live, right, my neighbors across the street have been in their house for 48 years. My neighbors next door have been there for 46 years. They don't go anywhere. I know them, their kids, their grandkids. So I see the generational structure of those families. I also know that at some point they're not going to live there and somebody else is. And so everything that I do in real estate is going to dictate that other neighbors are going to have the chance to do what those folks have done, live in a house, have stability, raise their kids and their grandkids in the way that they see fit, which is the liberty of being an American, to take care of your family in a great way. And that's where you have to think about real estate beyond the transaction. And if you're an investor, all right, look at it this way. Whatever you're investing in, there's people walking by your investment property. There's tenants that live there, and they're trying to create a better future for their family and for themselves. So what are you doing as an investor, as a housing provider? Because I don't like the word landlord. I think it's got too many negative connotations. But as a housing provider, what are you doing to give those tenants the chance at a better life? Well, one of the things that I do wherever I buy a property, I go knock on the doors of every neighbor and I say, hey, I bought this property here. If you ever have any issues or need anything, please call me. But just so you know, we have a neighbor that's already moving in over here, and her name is Monica. And if you ever want to say hey to Monica, that'd be great. Because when you start to create relationships amongst neighbors, you change communities. Communities start to unravel when people no longer know each other. And that's what I want to do a better job of as both an investor and as a realtor.
It
Awesome.
couldn't have been a better answer. I think you've said that quite a few times, and you're passionate about that. So I absolutely love it. Leigh, as we wrap this up, is there anything we didn't ask or that you were hoping that we asked you as we wrap this up?
I was hoping you were going to ask me if anybody should be investing in a market like we're in right now. We're recording this on what would have been tax day, April 15th, 2021. But of course, tax day got delayed. And when we're recording this, the market is pretty frothy all over the country. So I'm surprised you haven't asked me what my prognosis is on the market.
Well, go ahead. You asked.
What's your crystal ball say, Leigh? What's your crystal ball say?
So I will tell you this, and one thing I think is a frustration for a lot of the consumer public when it comes to real estate is when you talk to anybody in our space, they tend to get the response of, it's always a great time to buy or sell. It's not always great to buy and sell. It's always great for somebody to buy, and it's always great for somebody to sell, but it's never across the board. So I do think right now the market is pretty frothy, but also interest rates are low. So for the person who's buying a house next to their mama, and we know they're going to stay there for 25 years, could they probably pay above appraised value? Entirely possible, because that's a specific scenario. But
Can you define that? Sorry to interrupt you. Frothy. Can you define that for our listeners? What do you mean by that?
Frothy is a bazillion offers and very few properties to sell. The supply and demand ratio is out of whack.
Yes.
And
okay.
I guess you could look at it as when you're making a latte or a cappuccino and you don't leave enough space in the cup, and you're going to make that little froth for the top because we get to draw a picture and it's really pretty. But if the cup's too full, it runs over the top. And then you lose all the pretty froth because at some point the cup only holds so much. And I look at it in this way. The supply and demand situation is out of whack right now, but demand has shown no signs of letting up because demographically, y'all are younger than I am. I mean, Claire all knows how old I am, but younger people, you are a huge generation. The millennials and the Zoomers are just now starting to buy. Y'all were delayed in creating households, and you were delayed in getting out of your parents' houses, but the pandemic pushed a lot of people out who said, oh, I've been living in the basement. Oh, hell no, I am not working from home anymore from here. And they've moved into the market. So we have increased demand. We also have an immigration situation, which is likely to increase demand as well. But supply hasn't gone anywhere. And if you want to know why supply is not going anywhere, it's overburden of regulatory situations and permitting, because our local governments are out of control with what they charge builders and developers. And that's why, friends, things are too high on the new construction side. It ain't the builders, it ain't the developers. It is materials. It's not really labor, but your biggest problem are your local elected officials. And mark my words on that. Go to planning and zoning and see if Leigh Brown ain't right. But anyway, that situation is out of whack right now, but it's exacerbated by the emotion that comes into the market. And so pandemic has created emotions that cause people to bid, and they're bidding outside of logic. They're bidding into emotion, and that's what creates that froth. And that froth is where you're giving up your strategic decision in favor of emotion. And I don't think that's sustainable for the long haul. I do think we're going to have higher demand than supply for quite some time. But should you be paying above appraised value? I think those are specific scenarios. And the more we see that happen, the more it throws the market out of whack as far as what things are actually worth. And we know this in every market, right? There are some zip codes right now that are selling so high, you're like, I don't think y'all know what y'all are buying. That's under the flight path. It's next to the highway. There was a brownfield there, and there's a lot of issues, and nobody's talking about the issues because we act like everything in real estate's great. But we all know that a rising tide does raise all boats, but when the tide falls, the rocks appear really quickly. So I do think it's a great time to buy if you're smart about it. And I think it's a great time to sell if you're smart about it. But for heaven's sakes, you should never do any of that without talking to an educated local professional, whether it's your realtor or it's your investor coach or it's somebody who understands what your general goals are, because some properties will fit and some won't.
Well said, Leigh. Well said. This has been another fantastic episode of Not Just a Transaction. So if you're listening to this on iTunes or wherever else you choose to listen to, make sure you're rating and reviewing. And also, if you're looking to work with the Pre-Property Solutions team, make sure you go to prepropertysolutions.com/podcast and fill out that contact form. We are happy to help. Everybody have a fantastic day, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Not Just a Transaction. If you want to learn more on selling a home, buying a home, or resources to learn more, head on over to our website at originalre.com.